The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is award-winning Minnesota poet Barbara Esbensen. She'll be talking about her children's poetry books with another lover of language, librarian Lois Ringquist.
Yeah. Welcome, Barbara. We're delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
You've been quoted as saying you've had a lifelong love affair with words. Is that affair just doing with words as you write, or do you also like to read?
Well, of course, I've been a reader all of my life. I have a lifelong love affair with words and librarians. I would like all the librarians.
Well, thank you.
I think that librarians had a great deal to do with my love of reading and words. When I went to school in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was a child, our librarian's name was Mrs. Large. And I told her I was going to read every book in the Lowell School Library. And whenever a new book came in, she was sure to give me the book. And I felt that books are just words, and why can't I write also, I think.
What were your favorite books as a child?
My 100% favorite books early on, or when like 5th grade, when I was really mad about books, were all of the books by L.M. Montgomery. I read Anne of Green Gables, and then I read the Emily books. And Emily of New Moon, she named everything. And so I named everything. I mean, she named trees, bushes, rivers. I had a willow tree that I named Lady Willamere Weep. Because Emily did. And and also Jo in Little Women was another one of my heroines. And I noticed that all of them wanted to be writers. And look back on that.
You identified yourself as a writer by the time you were 14.
Yeah, I did.
But it took another 25 years before you published your first book, and then another 10 years before the second, and another 9 years before the third.
Well, Lois, I was writing things and sending things out, but you don't have any control over when you publish a book, and things kept coming back all the time.
But now it went from that long length of time in between to now one every year, and now 2 a year. What's going on?
What's going on is that once you have a book published, it's a lot easier to have a book published. I mean, people know who you are. When you come at a publisher as an unknown person with a manuscript, they don't know who you are. They're afraid that they'll lose money on whoever it is you think you are, and it's very hard to sell a book. When I sent Cold Stars and Fireflies to Harper, I had a lovely letter from Barbara Fenton who said, "We know that other publishers have told you that nobody knows who you are, you're an unknown, and we're going to take this book because," if I may say something very unhumble, she said, "we feel that we would be doing a disservice to children who wouldn't have a chance to read your poetry." And somebody said to me one time, they said, "Well, editors don't say that." And I said, "Yes, she did say that, and I've always wished that I had it in writing." But it was a real breakthrough, because once Harper took that book, then they were interested in anything else that I did, and it became much easier.
You didn't ask her to put it in writing so you could
keep
it?
I should have done that.
Well, your first book, Swing Around the Sun, which was published in 1964, I think,
65, yeah.
was a collection of rhymed poems. Most of your poetry could be characterized as free verse. It doesn't rhyme. I was taught years ago that, and let's see if I can get this, poetry was words written in rhythm with a pattern of line endings that rhymed.
I know, I was too. I learned some pretty terrible poems when I was a child. There are lovely poems that rhyme, and that really was the way children were taught. I tell children when I go out and talk to them, I tell them that Poems that rhyme are certainly poems, but to me, they're very predictable because there are only a handful of words in English that rhyme with each other. So if you hear a rhyming word at the end of a certain line, your brain is racing ahead and you're pretty well able to decide what that poet is going to rhyme with that word, since you know there aren't very many. And I have written some poems that rhyme, but I'm a good image maker, and I always feel that the images that come before the rhyme make it okay. And I tell kids, you're not good enough. You're going to wreck thoughts that you have because you're so busy going down moon, June, spittoon, baboon, that you're going to throw out things that otherwise would have been marvelous. Can I give you an example?
Sure.
I had a child write this poem. The seagull tries to put the puzzle of the sky together. In the lonely sky, the seagull hangs on the wind. Now that's a marvelous poem. And then I say to children, supposing that she was horsing around with rhyme now, what would she say? The seagull tries to put the puzzle of the sky together. The seagull wants to fly, let's see, in any weather, and it lost a feather. I mean, you get corny and terrible, where without the rhyme, a seagull tries to put the puzzle of the sky together is a gorgeous way of asking a question, how does a seagull know how to fly? And so I encourage children to use exciting images and forget about the rhyme. Though I have written a new book that'll be out next spring called Dance With Me, and I wrote poems about everything I could think of that can possibly rhyme, including the mirage that you see in front of the car, you know, as you're going along in the summer, waves that come into the shore, dust motes that you see hanging, wind, you know, and that was fun. But I think that the images are strong enough so that the rhyme isn't corny or expectable, but we'll see.
All right. You've talked a lot around. Now tell me, what is poetry?
I think that poetry is language that gives clues to something that we already know a lot about. And it's talking about things that we are familiar with, but in some kind of fresh, new way. For instance, in one of the poems that rhymes, which I can't quote to you, I don't probably know most of my poetry by heart, but I know that I called the waves that come into the shore, it says, every spangled knee joint kicks out a green stocking. And the poem is called Dance Line at High Tide. And the waves coming in reminded me of the Rockettes, you know. So I'm trying to give you an image of something that you can picture in your head. It's something that everybody has seen, but I'm trying to say it in a different way. And I tell children, if you've heard it before, cross it out, because I've heard it before. I tell children, I'm 100 years old, and if you've heard it before, think how many times I've heard it. Well, I had a teacher come down to the cafeteria where I was eating one day after I told some first graders this. I told them I didn't want to hear that rain goes pitter-patter. And we were talking about how you can talk about rain. And I said, if you've heard pitter-patter, think of me, I'm 100 years old, and think how many times I've heard rain goes pitter-patter. I don't want to hear it anymore. And the teacher came down, she said, I have to ask you a very personal question, Mrs. Esbensen. And I said, what? And she said, well, the first graders want to know if you use oil of Olay. And I said, why? Why? And she said, they don't have any trouble believing that you're 100 years old, but they think you should be more wrinkly.
Oh, well, I know sometime in the past I read one of your poems, and it was about bubbles. And now when I see children blowing bubbles, I think of the phrase, I think it was rainbow skin.
Yeah.
And I think of that when I see children blowing bubbles, because the outside of the bubble does.
Well, and I think poetry, and I'm probably the kind of person that does this a lot too, just in my own head, but I'm always trying to think, what does that remind me of? And then not that the bubble is covered with something that looks like skin with rainbows running on it, but that it is rainbow skin. And that makes a stronger statement. It's true.
Why is poetry important?
I think it's important just because it shows how fresh language can be. So if anything that I write seems ordinary, then it really hasn't been a success as a good poem. I'm sure that some of my poems are better than others, and I'm trying always to give another spin on what everybody sees every day. I mean, we all have identical experiences just about in nature and at home, and we see a spoon, we see dust, we see some kind of bird, we see something, we see puddles in the rain, and it's just boring to say it's raining. But one of the poems that rhyme and dance with me has to do with rain as tap dancers on my roof. It was just fun to think of. I was trying to think of everything that can dance, and I thought, well, rain dances on the roof. But not only does it dance, but I pictured it in a top hat and a cane. So that just gives a different spin on ordinary things.
You've taught creative writing and poetry making. In fact, you've even written a book about it, A Celebration of Bees. I think there's a story behind that, too. To both children and adults. Someone asked me last week when I said I was going to interview you, well, can just anybody write poetry? What do you think?
I think anybody can play around with language and get some very interesting and exciting sentences and phrases down on paper. I don't think just anybody can, quote unquote, be a poet maybe, because you have to sweat a lot, and it isn't for everybody. But in classes that I've taught adults, they're always surprised at what they can come up with if they just throw the words out, shake them around, and put words together, as a friend of mine who's a poet likes to say, words that have never met each other before, and see what happens. Like the seagull and the puzzle. Who's ever heard of seagull and puzzle being in the same sentence, let alone in the same poem? And that, when you do that, it puts an image in your mind that's absolutely unknown before. I had a child
very fresh.
Yeah, very fresh. I think I've told you this before, Lois. I had a child who put wrinkled and gown together in a poem about winter and said, "Under the snow, the river freezes like a wrinkled gown." Now, that's just an astonishing and accurate kind of thing. I feel that poetry has to be accurate. Archibald MacLeish once said, "A poem is not true, but equal to." So it's not exactly true, but it stands for what is happening.
Well, I think Celebration of Bees was written, wasn't it, to help teachers teach children? But you said something about it's going to be republished?
Henry Holt is going to be republishing A Celebration of Bees. And when I wrote it, I focused it on the classroom and ideas for teachers. And I'm kind of talking directly to teachers. We're going to redo it so that parents come into the picture too, so that I can be talking to parents about how they can encourage children to monkey around with words.
Well, along with that, how can a parent or a teacher develop an appreciation for poetry? Maybe they can't be poets, but develop an appreciation of poetry in children.
A lot of the good prose that's written has elements of poetry in the writing, wonderful verbs. Maniac McGee, for instance, is a book that I often carry around with me when I go to schools. Jerry Spinelli,
Really?
in that book, Jerry Spinelli says something like, I can't quote it exactly, but he says, at the beginning of November, the weather came in and tickled us under the chin. But the day before Thanksgiving, the weather kicked us in the stomach. Now, I say to children, how would the weatherman say this? He'd say, well, November started out nice, but the day before Thanksgiving, we had a blizzard or whatever, and that would just be boring, and it's true. It's absolutely true, but it's boring. But tickled us under the chin tells you have a mild, playful day, and kicked us in the stomach tells us you don't. Tells us that the weather is out to get ya. And that's in a book that's a big book, 130 pages of Maniac McGee, a novel for children. But I look for that kind of writing. in people's fiction too. The good writing, I think teachers can point out images, wonderful verbs. When I was very surprised when I wrote the Loon book, Great Northern Diver, I thought I was writing an absolutely cold, factual science book. And when the reviews came out, it said that it was a lyrical evocation of loons. And when I reread it, I saw I have strong verbs. Maybe that's what makes someone think it's lyrical. It's hard to know.
You've had 6 children. What do they think of your writing?
Well, I'll tell you, apparently they've taken it. To me, I didn't start until I was about 45, and so it seems to me it took me a long time to write books for children. But my children were just growing up then, so they think I've always done this, so they don't think it's anything too special, except that one day at an Umba breakfast, I sat next to Captain Kangaroo, and that really snapped their heads around, because their feeling was, gosh, if that's the kind of thing my mother's going to do, it must be pretty interesting. Must be pretty.
Are any of them writers?
Yes, they write very well. My youngest is 23, and he is an editor in a publishing house in downtown Minneapolis. I give him my stuff to look at. He has a very good ear. He's a marvelous writer. He's better, when he was 17, he was better than I was at 17, I'm sure. He's a really
I thought
good
he was a
writer.
musician.
Yeah, he's a musician also. He's also good in art. He doesn't even want to hear that from me, but he is a very good artist. And my daughter Jane is a marvelous writer. She speaks. She goes in and she's a speaker, and her writing is excellent. And all of the others too, they write more, expository kinds of things. My oldest daughter Julie says she's writing a novel. So
Really?
haven't seen it.
How do you decide what to write about?
I pick a theme sometimes. That's one thing I did for Dance With Me, for instance. I made a big list of everything that can dance. I just made a huge list. Who Shrank My Grandmother's House is poems of discovery. I wrote down all kinds of things that I thought children maybe don't know and I would like them to know, or things that I found out about kind of late in life. Like, I didn't know that if you broke a sand dollar that you had these 5 white birds that come out, so I wrote a poem about that.
And I didn't know until I read that book that they were the teeth.
I didn't know that either. I had to look that up. I didn't know that if you cut an apple the way you cut an orange that you got a star until I was a mother. I had never seen that, because you never do that. You always cut the apple the other way. Seemed to me that was a very exciting kind of thing. So I give myself a kind of theme, and then I just write down a list of everything I can think of. And I cross those things out as I write a poem about them. Zip, it goes out.
But you do write more than one poem about some things.
Yeah. Well, the Coal Stars and Fireflies, and what else? Are poems of the seasons. I have seasons in a lot of my books.
When and where do you write?
I really can write anywhere if I have to, but I have a computer, so that limits me. I don't have a laptop computer, and I have a writing room on the second floor of my house, right off my bedroom, and nobody's supposed to come in there when I'm writing.
Ooh, that's
so that's
nice.
nice. Yes, I have
You
a
have
cat.
everyone trained?
Yes, I do, and I only have one at home now. But the grandchildren kind of don't know that, and they kind of come in and flop around. And I have a cat that sits on my lap and puts his paw on the keyboard, and I'm looking up and I see a row of Z.
I hope that that's not his editorial comment.
Yeah, right. I don't know.
It's been said that one of your greatest gifts as a poet is your ability to see the world through fresh images. What is it about you and how you view the world that brings you to put down on paper such beautiful and different impressions?
I don't know.
Is it your training as an artist?
I think probably a lot of it is I was an art teacher for a long time. I majored in art, and I taught art for a long time. And my dad was he was a doctor, but I think he always wanted to be an artist. And he used to point things out to me when I was just a little kid, and when I was growing up, like 10, 11, 12 years old. He would say to me, look at those trees now. If you were going to paint that, how many kinds of green do you see there? And so I really have developed an eye for shadow and form and color, I think. And then there's just something else. There's a leap that I make a lot of times. I always think everybody's thinking that way. And then when it gets down on paper and somebody tells me they hadn't thought of it, it surprises me because it seems very ordinary to me. It seems like fun, you know, so I write it down, but I don't really know that it's that unusual. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Yeah. Well, you started out as a poet, but you've certainly proved to be a very versatile writer. After the poetry, you went to the Ojibwe folk
The
tales,
legends,
and then the very lyric nonfiction, Great Northern Diver.
Lyric.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it is.
But if you look at the poetry, somebody was interviewing me one time and noticed that almost everything I do has something to do with the world around me, science or nature. I have a book of poetry coming out next fall that is going to say what I'm thinking about, things in patterns in nature that repeat themselves, repeating patterns in nature.
For example?
For example, an uncurling fern is a spiral, and so is our galaxy a spiral, and so is the chameleon's tail, for instance. And the helix, you know, that double helix, that's DNA. A single helix, an example of that is a tendril from a grapevine, you know, that goes like this.
Oh.
And a mountain goat's horns. If you continued drawing the way those horns come out, it would be a helix. Branching systems, lightning branches, rivers branch, the veins in your arm, the veins in your body are all branching. So I think it's going to be an interesting book. But that's science.
Yes. Well, you've done some really, I would say, pure science in a couple of recent publications. Let's Read and Find Out science series, Sponges or Skeletons, and
the whale book.
Baby whales drink milk.
I can't get enough of what's going on in the world around me. I mean, and things are coming to our knowledge too that nobody knew before, and you know, there is just more and more knowledge. People didn't really think about whales nursing, for instance. You know, they kind of thought of them as big fish, and so it's fun for me to write about things that clear that stuff up for young children.
Well, you're doing some other folk tales too, aren't you?
I'm this fall. There will be a book
in
coming
93.
up in
94.
It's going to be a Seneca Tale retold. The Seneca Indians lived on the East Coast. They were part of the Iroquois Nation. And surprisingly, this is a story about buffalo. Now, we were surprised that buffalo came into legends on the East Coast, but centuries ago, the buffalo crossed the Mississippi River and spread out all the way to Tennessee.
Really?
The settlers out there used to shoot them at salt licks and they spread up into Canada, into northern Canada. So they were in the New York area. And this is a story of why the buffalo has a hump, why his head is always pointed toward the ground, and why there are always little brown birds circling around the buffalo's head. And it's a story of disobedience and punishment. It's an interesting story. It's very lively.
You've received a number of awards over the years for individual titles. For example, the Minnesota Book Award for The Star Maiden, and several of your books have been on notable lists for ALA or the science teachers. Recently, however, you have been awarded the 1994 National Council of Teachers of English, let's see if I have this right, Award of Excellence in Poetry for Children for the body of your work.
Yes, that's very nice.
How did that make you feel?
Astounded. I told my husband, my gosh, I know everybody on this list. I know the names of every single person that's ever had this award. I'm the 10th person to receive the award. For a while it was given every year, and then in the 80s I think they started giving it every 3 years, and it's for your body of work. And the people on it are Myra Cohn Livingston, Arnold Adolph, Valerie Worth, Carla Cuskin, John Ciardi, and me.
You're in very good
yes,
company.
I'm in very good company. And the thing that's kind of charming is that years and years ago in the 60s, I sent some poetry to John Ciardi, who was then editor of Saturday Review of Literature. not necessarily poetry for children. I don't know, can't remember what I sent him. It always came back. And now we're on the same list, now that I've grown up. Well, I know what I'm doing.
Oh. In most of your books, there's an author's note that really adds to the reader's appreciation, and it certainly does to mine, the appreciation of the work. How did those start?
Well, you know, I think that in Who Shrank My Grandmother's House, Poems of Discovery, my editors really wanted me to tell children, what do I mean by discovery? And so I tried to do that in that author's note. And in Echoes for the Eye, which is the poem about patterns in nature, I'm talking about why am I interested in patterns in nature, and I say we in that author's note, and both Helen Davey and I sign it with our signature at the bottom of the author's note because we're so in sync with this book. Usually an author does not know their artist, but I've met Helen, and we both talk about a love affair. We've always wanted to write or illustrate, or both, a book about patterns in nature. You have several books scheduled for publication in already for 1995 and 1996. Yes.
What can you tell us about those?
In the spring of 1995, the book that I wrote a while ago called The Dream Mouse, and the subtitle is A Lullaby Tale from Old Latvia. I took folk wisdom or folk songs, they're kind of both, little 4-line things that were written in Latvian, and I received a translation of those from a man that I met at a Kurlan meeting where they had invited the then Soviet artists and writers of children's books, and this man had asked me if I'd be interested in doing something. He was going to send me a translation of these, and the stuff was very, very interesting, and I was able to use tons of their material, and then I wove my own words into it. And then this Dance With Me, which is poems that rhyme, that'll come out in the spring of 95. And a Seneca Tale is coming out this fall, which is 94. And in the fall of 95, there'll be a book. That's the Echoes for the Eye.
You have one on the Aurora Borealis,
and
too.
the Aurora Borealis will probably be fall of 96. And in spring of 96, there's a book called Swift as the Wind, and it is about the cheetah.
Oh.
And that's been very interesting and exciting and worrisome because it's an endangered animal.
Barbara, could you share just one small poem with us?
Yeah, this is fast. This is called Dust Dancers. It's a poem that rhymes. Twinkling and small as the point of a pin, the dust dancers all wait to float in. They wait in the gloom for a sun spike of light to stab through the room and illumine their flight. If you breathe on the crowd, their rhythms are stirred, and you're only allowed the tiniest word. Clouds make them hide, but they shine in the sun, and as hard as I've tried, I've never caught one.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome. This has been fun.
Barbara Esbensen's many books, which are available in your local public library and in local bookstores, are a wonderful way to introduce poetry to your children. Thank you, Barbara Esbensen, Lois Ringquist. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency.